In July of 2014, after a competitive process, which the city blew everybody away, we actually moved to a 10 gig network. So we tenfold increased our bandwidth and saved $100,000 in one fell swoop.
Good day and welcome to episode 186 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. I'm Lisa Gonzalez. Educators are finding exciting new ways to teach our children. This is great news for kids who have the opportunity to experience exciting new technologies that inspire their learning process. On the flip side, many of these new approaches require fast, affordable, reliable connectivity that schools just don't have or struggle to afford. In this podcast, Chris talks with Joe McBreen, Chief Technology Officer for the St. Vrain Valley School District in Longmont, Colorado. After years of working with incumbents, the school district found a way to obtain better service for less by collaborating with the city of Longmont. Here are Chris and Joe talking about the process and how life has changed at the St. Vrain Valley School District.
Welcome to the Community Broadband Bits podcast. I'm Chris Mitchell, and today I'm speaking with Joe McBreen, the Chief Technology Officer for the St. Vrain Valley School District. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I first came into contact with you, I think, when we were looking at what was happening in Longmont, which is part of your territory. Where else does St. Vrain Valley go?
Yeah, we are located approximately 30 miles north of the Denver metro area between the towns of Boulder and Fort Collins. And our school district not only includes Longmont, Colorado, but also Lyons, Niwot, Meade, Frederick. Basically, we have exactly 411 square miles that our district serves. So it's a pretty big district. Have a lot of country, have a lot of city. So we're a pretty good reflection of Americana, if you ask folks around here.
Right. Well, Longmont itself is bigger than I think a lot of people realize, at about 80,000 people. So that's definitely quite urban. Some of those areas are pretty rural out there in Colorado.
We have that. We have a really good variety of economic and socioeconomic diversity, racial diversity, if you will. And so, yeah, I'm really pleased to live and work in this community.
Well, you and I had talked a few years back in something that we didn't do a whole lot of publicity around, but was when we were trying to get a better sense of how schools work with the E-rate and how networks work and what the pressures you face are. And I had a great time talking with you, and I wanted to bring you back on to talk a little bit about those questions, basically. I think the first thing I'd like to ask you is, we often talk about how the schools need more connectivity and schools that don't have enough connectivity. But I thought a good place to start is asking, why do schools need so much more bandwidth than many of them have?
Really, it comes down to the fact that education is changing radically from the way adults learned. Let me give you a few examples. We grew up with paper textbooks, and historically, the way school districts typically have textbooks is they get new textbooks every 7 years. Well, except 5 to 7 years, depending on the district and the subject area. But the reality is nowadays, curriculums, textbooks are moving to a digital delivery system, and so that right there is a big need for more bandwidth. Is the curriculum's digital, and besides that, I don't know if you've watched any students in the K through 12 space navigate their world, whether they're on an iPad or a Chromebook or a laptop or whatnot, but the content that they consume or demand, if you will, need is video-based. It's not the text-based internet of the 90s that so many of us think about when we think about internet usage. It's very video-heavy, very multimedia rich, if you will. So learning itself is changing.
One of the things that I found interesting was sort of, if you think about that, I think some people might say, wow, I learned just fine on paper textbooks. And one of the things that someone showed me was how much easier it was to learn about the human circulatory system if you could be looking at 3D models, if you could be, like being able to zoom in and zoom out, if you could actually see the heart beating. It's remarkable.
Yeah, it's beyond remarkable. It just makes a lot of sense from a brain science perspective. I mean, the reality is every human learns a little differently, uses different modalities, if you will, to learn. Some are visual, some are auditory. Really, what technology does is that it enhances the learning experience so that different learners' needs can be met, and it's just getting better and better. Here's another example of the need for more bandwidth, more digital materials, and that's library books. Our district over the last several years has been consciously moving away from the model where it was 99% paper or pulp books in the library, maybe 1% digital. That's flip-flopped on its head where approximately 90% of our books are available online and only 20% are available in paper format, like as a rule of thumb. Teachers back in the day, and actually in many parts of America today, were required to print a ton of paper for worksheets, for tests, for things like that, all digital now. So there's huge savings to be made, but there's also the bandwidth that goes along with that.
One of the things that I found interesting and something that you had recently noted in an email was summed up in a different conversation I had with a different school CTO, actually. And he said anytime there's a disciplinary problem or question, the question the parents ask or that the supervisors ask is, show me the video. Where's the video? And one of the things you note is there's a tremendous demand for bandwidth for video in schools, just for monitoring hallway activity and things like that.
Trust me, my wife is an assistant principal at one of the local high schools, and she could speak to this subject at length, but video is a reality in most schools nowadays. They want video surveillance inside, they want video surveillance outside, and that's normal operating. But what happens if there's a crisis situation, a lockout or a lockdown or an active shooter situation? What an opportunity having ample bandwidth and IP security cameras in place offers our first responders, our SWAT teams and whatnot, if they can get live views inside and outside of the facility.
One of the things that I had pointed out to you was the wonderful demonstration. Wonderful is an interesting word, I guess, but the stunning, powerful demonstration that Ammon, Idaho has gone through with how they manage theirs on their fiber. And one of the things that I think sets them apart is that they have this dedicated fiber to each location. One of the things I wanted to talk with you about is how you moved from a network in which you had a bunch of facilities that were all sharing a fiber connection to one where they each have dedicated fiber, I think. So can you tell us a little bit about the network that you just moved away from?
Our story's probably very typical of many schools and community businesses, if you will, where, it wasn't too many years ago when we had T1 lines or, multiple T1 lines feeding a building. And then back in 2009, we moved to a 1 gig fiber connection to our schools. Now, we're very interesting, Chris, because we have both point-to-point fiber and fiber rings. The city of Longmont itself, many years ago, we're talking like back in the late 90s, there was a company called Yipes. But Yipes had a really great vision to lay fiber in towns, and luckily Longmont was one of the 2 or 3 that I understand they actually started with. And unfortunately, that company went out of business very quickly, but not before they had a bunch of dark fiber laying in the trenches all over town in 2 physical rings. And so the city of Longmont assumed those assets. Long story short, the voters approved using those assets to deliver broadband services to the community, and of course the school district is part of the community, as is the hospital. And so I'm very proud of our city broadband folks, the way they went about their job. What happened to our school district in the town of Longmont? So we have 32 schools in the town of Longmont, and they are on the ring. Like I said before, there are 2 physical rings, but we'll just say the ring, the city ring. And a year and a half ago, or gosh, maybe 2 years ago is a better way to say it, we were with a different vendor, and we were subscribed to a 1 gigabit per second shared ring. And in July of 2014, after a competitive process, which the city blew everybody away, we actually moved to a 10 gig network. So we tenfold increased our bandwidth and saved $100,000 in one fell swoop.
Is that $100,000 a year, or is that over the life of the contract?
Per year.
Wow.
Huge savings for us. Nobody can argue with those economics. It's beyond wonderful. So that describes our in-town infrastructure, 10 gig fiber ring. But then we have, I think I opened up the show with saying that we're dispersed across 411 square miles. Well, obviously those outlying towns aren't going to be connected to the ring. So we actually have point-to-point fibers going out to them that we are currently in the process of upgrading from 1 gig to 10 gig.
And if I remember correctly, I think those were ones that you had worked with. There's some private companies that specialize in basically building those and leasing them and that sort of thing. So you've gone with them rather than one of the local larger companies. Is that right?
Yeah, that was done back in July of 2009, and it's a 10-year lease. That's where we are with those outlying schools. But I guess to summarize it, at the end of the day, all of our schools will have a 10 gig connection here very shortly, which, is appropriate and necessary nowadays.
And so one of the things that we talked about that there's some things that I find surprising, and then there's some things that basically knock my socks off. And I did not anticipate this, but when we talked, I was asking you about the difference of running your own network as a school district versus leasing lines. And I was trying to get a sense of how much more personnel, what the extra costs might be for you in running your own network rather than leasing lines from, say, like the big telephone company. And you told me that it was actually cheaper from a personnel standpoint, you thought, because when you're running your own network, that when something goes wrong, you can figure out what it is more quickly rather than having people waiting on hold and waiting for other people to get back to you as to what's happening on their network.
Yeah, it's you hit it on the head. The point-to-point gigabit connections to our outlying schools cost us approximately right at $800,000 per year to lease. Well, we will have done that for 10 years. You do the math. That's a big investment. Are you following so far?
Yes.
Okay, so that's the outlying schools that we're leasing through that provider.
And this is, just to be clear, we're not suggesting this is a bad deal. This is a pretty run-of-the-mill deal. It's you're getting good capacity connections, and it was a pretty good deal when it was struck. This is not one of those instances. There's what I want to say is that a lot of schools are in a much worse position where they would be envious of that contract even.
Yeah, they would. That's a fair point.
But at any rate, that's sort of your worst-case scenario right now.
Yeah. And then, so there's that. So for all of those outlying schools, approximately $800,000 every year. And at the end of that, like I said, we're leasing it. We don't technically own anything. So we'll have to re-up the lease. And, we expect, and they've committed verbally to radically lowering the price per year from $800,000 to something more reasonable. That said, contrast that with our 10 gig rings here that all of the in-city schools are using, and that's right at $150,000 per year. Anybody can do the math, like, wow, radical difference.
And one of the things that you were looking at is whether you could do it at a lower cost just within the school district rather than leasing from the city. And I think, if I remember correctly, you would have been able to do it at a lower cost than you're paying for those outlying districts. But because Longmont had that, it's sort of the benefit of the scale and operating across the entire city, they were able to offer you an even better deal.
Let's pretend that our city wasn't the winner, and we had to go with the second or third place competitor for our 10 gig WAN. We could have easily beaten what they proposed by going with dark fiber, buying our own electronics, and hiring a full-time technician devoted to that. It's not even close.
And what does that mean when you say, I think people, when you say buying your own electronics, I think you might lose people, but is that very intimidating? Is that something you go to, newegg.com and buy them off the shelf? How does that work?
I would go with your local vendor. We are a Cisco shop, but it doesn't matter who your network infrastructure vendor is. They will gladly tell you what what little electronic piece you need to buy to plug into your switch so that you can connect that piece of fiber that was previously dark but now all of a sudden has light running through it.
A question that I wrestle with is how, a CTO or a CIO in a school district that hasn't done this before, should they be intimidated by the process?
Oh gosh, absolutely not. One of the things that I've been blessed with is I'm not afraid to ask, quote, ignorant questions, right? I don't care. I need to know. And I would just encourage that of anybody who might get that lump in their throat like, oh my gosh, I don't want to look stupid, or oh gosh, this is intimidating. Vendors are there to really do a good job. You ask them as many questions as you need until, you're satisfied. But it should not be intimidating. Back in the early 2000s, I worked as a technical trainer for a broadband equipment company, doing everything from advanced training to my favorite classes were actually the basic fiber and basic T1 courses and things like that, because people like CTOs and whatnot would come in and say, I'm working in this broadband space, can you teach me this lingo? And inevitably after about 4 or 5 hours of study, they go, oh my God, this stuff is so easy. I don't know why people make it seem so complicated. So I'm just encouraging your listeners to go ahead and ask those questions, invest some time, and you'll be pleasantly surprised. This is not rocket surgery.
And so is there anything else that you think our listeners should know about being the CTO and the network and these telecommunications things that you wrestle with?
I'm a big fan of that old quote that's been attributed to Wayne Gretzky, the one about skate to where the puck is going.
I use that often, yes.
Right, and that just makes so much sense to me. So you have that, I guess, that ethical responsibility of, anybody in a leadership role needs to be thinking about where we're going and knowing that infrastructure improvements are so critical and that, it always takes twice as long to install as you typically think it will. The time to act and have these discussions is right now. You have to be thinking in the future, but the reality is, at least for schools and libraries, is we have the wonderful E-rate program, which is just, one of the best things the government ever did. So without that, I don't know where schools and libraries would be.
Well, actually, that brings up an interesting question, which is, I think, how do you get to the home? As a school district, you shouldn't be responsible for, and you do not have the resources to solve the problem of making sure every child is connected in the home. And yet, a lot of educational success depends on kids being able to do work at home and thinking at home and educating themselves to some extent. How do you wrestle with that issue?
That's an interesting question that many people don't like my answer to. Right now, today, we have 12,000 iPads as part of our ongoing technology program. We also have an additional 4,000 iPads that came from, we were one of the 16 school districts in the nation that won the Race to the Top grant a couple of years ago. So 4,000 iPads came from the Race to the Top grant. Plus, we have like 7,500 Chromebooks, plus a couple thousand laptops, Windows, Macs, stuff like that. So and we also open up our wireless network to public access, so moms and dads and kids who bring their own devices to school can get on the wireless network. So on any given day, we have, approximately 2,700 devices on our wireless network. And so it's a pretty big load, right? But I'm going to go back to the iPad comment. One of the reasons we chose the iPad a couple of years ago is because it had the ability to store files locally to take away that digital divide reality that some kids just can't afford, internet access at home.
Right.
Maybe your listeners know or not, but lots of companies like Comcast offer internet essentials for $10 a month. If you produce proof or paperwork that you're on free or reduced lunch, they'll give you a $10 a month internet, and for $150 they'll sell you a little laptop. So there's ways to get home internet access, but even in my school district, we have 32,000 kids. Only 640 families are taking advantage of that $10 a month broadband. And so one of my favorite things is I will go out and shadow a student all day a couple of times a year. I just got done doing 7th graders not too many months ago. So I would go from the opening bell to the closing bell, yes, eating lunch with them and all, and walk around with them. And during those times, I get a chance to visit with other kids, and I ask questions like, hey, what do you do for home internet access? Knowing that this is a very poor school, right? And inevitably, do you have home internet access? This one kid, I can picture him clearly, he says, no. And I'm like, wow, that's got to be really tough. What do you do for, wireless? He says, oh, I just use my neighbor's wireless. He gave me the password. And I'm like, oh, God, pirating his neighbor's Wi-Fi. That's right. Not what we're hoping for. But, the reality is that between businesses and neighbors, and here's another huge one, smartphones with hotspot extenders. Kids, I can honestly tell you that after we're in our 3rd year of doing this iPad rollout, I haven't had not one parent complaint to my desk about not having home internet access.
Well, it's hopeful. And I think to some extent, it gives me a reassurance that people do find local ways. It may not be the way that as a policymaker we think is the most efficient, but people find a way generally.
Yeah, they do. And I'm not promoting that, and I'm not saying that's great either. I'm just saying that's the reality.
Right, and I think I'd be curious, have you shadowed kids in the more rural districts where they may not have a neighbor where Wi-Fi would range all the way over to them?
No, I haven't, but I'm actually scheduled to do that in early March, so I'll let you know if I bump into anything in that area.
Well, I'd be curious, but it's also just great that you do that. That seems like such a smart way of getting a sense of what's really happening in the schools.
Oh my gosh. I don't care what business you're in. You have to go spend a solid day in your customer's shoes. In my case, my customer's students.
I think that's great advice. One of the things that my organization has worked on for 40 years is solid waste policy. And one of the first things when we would get a contract, it's not something that I worked on, I'm being in a different program, but the lore of our institute is one of the first things we would do is one of the people, particularly one of our founders, would ride around in a garbage truck with the people all day to see what the waste stream was like. And that was just unheard of, that someone working on policy would actually go down to that level to see what was happening, but it's essential.
How powerful is that?
Yeah. Well, that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Truly. Thank you.
That was Chris talking with Joe McBreen, Chief Technology Officer of the St. Vrain Valley School District in Longmont, Colorado. We have a number of articles on Longmont, so be sure to check out the tag at muninetworks.org. We want to hear your ideas for the show. Email us at podcast@muninetworks.org. You can follow Chris on Twitter. His handle is @CommunityNets. You can also follow muninetworks.org stories on Twitter, where the handle is @muninetworks.org. Thank you, Arnie Hughesby, for the song Warm Duck Shuffle, licensed through Creative Commons, and thank you for listening to episode 186 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast.